Well, the line of that song that we just sang, "Great is your faithfulness to me," it just hit me that, like, so many times when we sing lyrics and stuff like that, we can think about the greatness of who God is. But it struck me this morning, like, great is your faithfulness to me. Like the God that is faithful to raise the sun every single day, the God that is faithful to send rain when he sees fit to send rain, the God that is faithful to bring the promises of Israel to fruition, the God that is faithful in all of those things owes no allegiance to me, right? He owes no allegiance to you and I, but great is his faithfulness to me. Great is his faithfulness to you. So we do nothing to earn his faithfulness. We do nothing that says his allegiance is to us. But yet you woke up today and the Lord was faithful to you. Like, just the beauty of that lyric and just reminding us of the greatness of who God is, and we don't deserve the life, the blessings, the joy that we have. Like, it is sheerly out of the grace of God that he pours that on us. And so as we look into the book of Acts, I can't help but wonder if we've seen the similarities between the ancient Christ followers and ourselves now. I can't help but wonder if they thought the same thing. Especially as we talked about last week, where you have these group of these 7 men that are selected, known as the Hellenist Jews. So they're Jews that speak Greek, which already created division within the Jewish way of thinking, like you are God's people, but yet you're kind of giving yourself to the culture of the day and speaking their language. Like, how is this possible? But the Lord begins to move within their people as well. And so you have these Hellenist Jews who begin to proclaim the gospel. So 7 are selected in Acts chapter 6. And so they have to be thinking like, man, this is greater. Like the faithfulness of the Lord is greater than what we can imagine. So in Acts chapter 7, it moves into this story of following along with a couple of these guys. One of them goes by the name of Stephen, that if you grew up in the church, you may be familiar with who he is. But Stephen is one of the original 7 that is selected by the disciples to begin to distribute and make sure that the widows are being taken care of within the church. But then also Stephen not only does that, but he goes out and he begins to preach the gospel to others. He tells the people around him in Jerusalem, hey, this is who Jesus is. This is why he came. And so when that happens, as we see unfold over and over in the book of Acts, this upsets the political and religious leaders of the day. So they arrest him and they bring him before the leaders of the temple, the religious leaders of the day, and ask him, quiz him, what are you doing? By whose name are you doing this? All of these questions. And then Stephen delivers this speech in all of chapter 7 of the book of Acts, in which he charges the leaders of Israel. And he says, there's 2 things wrong with what you've been doing. The first thing that you've been doing wrong is you've consistently rejected the leaders that God has appointed over the Israelite people. You rejected Moses, and then you went on and you rejected the prophets, and then you went on and you rejected this guy named Jesus. Like, God has consistently put forth leaders in front of you, and you have rejected them. But he says, not only have you rejected them, you've come up with this idea within your religious system that God only works in the city of Jerusalem, that this is where God is moving and working in the world. And so he goes throughout the history of Israel and explains he moved in ancient Mesopotamia, he moved in Egypt, he moved outside of Jerusalem. And so it's this reiteration that he's going like, you have got it completely wrong. You have rejected Jesus, and you have this false idea that God is only working within Jerusalem. And this upsets the leaders that he's talking to so bad that they begin to pick up stones to stone him to death. And then we get introduced at the end of this account where I have a young guy named Saul who people give their coats to hold to, and the text says that he is approving of the execution of this Christ follower named Stephen. Now, this is the first instance that we see of a guy named Saul that we know goes on to become Paul, who writes 13 letters of the New Testament, becomes the greatest missionary that the world has ever seen. And so at this particular time, he's watching the stoning of Stephen, and he approves at what is taking place. And so right after this stoning takes place, we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 8, in which the church begins to move forward within the ancient world. So in Acts chapter 8, starting in verse 1, it says, "And there arose in that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house as he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. So persecution, Stephen is stoned to death. Persecution begins to arise for the Christians that are in Jerusalem, and so they begin to scatter throughout Judea and Samaria. Now, those two texts are highlighted because Luke, who's the author of Acts, is trying to cue us in on to something. So in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, if you want to flip back there really quickly, Acts chapter 1, verse 8, an infamous passage within the book of Acts, Luke writes, in recording what Jesus said to his disciples, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all of Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So right before Jesus ascends, he looks at his 11 followers that have been following after him for these 3 years, and he says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the ends of the earth." So there's a map I want you to look at this morning. As we think about Acts chapter 1, in verse 8, think of Acts chapter 1, verse 8 in concentric circles, right? So the first circle that Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem." This is the town in which you were in. This is where you will be my witnesses. But then I want you to move out to Judea, the area surrounding Jerusalem. But then I want you to move out to an area known as Samaria that's kind of surrounding that. And eventually I want you to work to the ends of the earth. Everything that you know of at this particular time, I want you to take the gospel there. And so at this point in the history, in the storyline of Acts, everything that has been taking place has centered in and around Jerusalem. So the disciples have been faithful in Jerusalem. Persecution arises, and then where do these witnesses go? They go to Judea and they go to Samaria. They're working the gospel out. And so it's a reminder to us this morning that something that we cannot miss, that God has the ability to use bad situations for his purposes. So you have these religious leaders that think if we can stop the church, if we can persecute the church, if we can arrest enough of them, if we have to stone them, so be it. If we can do this, we can stop the advancement of the church throughout the world. So they begin to persecute the believers. But what they don't realize is that God is so powerful, so great is his faithfulness towards his people, that they are going to persecute him. What is a bad situation, God begins to use for his purposes. It is only through this persecution that the disciples begin to scatter throughout the known world. So what the church, or what the leaders tried to shut down the church, God then turned and used to scatter his church, to spread his gospel throughout the ancient world. And so for us, we have got to just a quick reminder as we're looking into this part of the book of Acts, is that God has the ability to use whatever he wants, good or evil, to accomplish his purposes in the world. That there is nothing that is going to stop the plan of God. This is over and over what we see in the book of Acts, that there are forces that are trying to stop the advancement of the church, and God says, no, whatever you do, good or bad, my gospel will carry forth. And so then in the book of Acts, we see this scattering, and then it follows along with this guy named Philip, beginning in Acts chapter 8. So Philip and Stephen are both guys that were selected. The 7 that were selected back in Acts chapter 8. We're kind of highlighting these two. Luke is highlighting these two characters. So Stephen, the martyrdom of Stephen takes place. Then the focus begins to switch to a guy named Philip. So look in Acts chapter 8, starting in verse 4. It says, "Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them Christ. And the crowds with one accord paid attention to what is being said by Philip when they heard him and saw signs of what he did. For unclean spirits were crying out with a loud voice and came out of many who had them, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was much joy in that city." So Philip is evidently part of this persecution that's going on. He's part of the original 7. Persecution sets in. He begins to scatter, and he goes to Samaria. So I want you to look at this map again, like to remind ourselves just geographically what is taking place here. So the persecution happens in Jerusalem. One of the circles that takes place is Samaria. So he goes to this northwest portion of ancient Israel, and he begins to proclaim the gospel. So Philip is a guy that's taking the gospel further out into the world. Now, there's a couple of things I want to highlight in verses 4 and 5 within chapter 8. So the first thing in verse 4, it says, now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Now, to preach the word means to announce good news. That is what it meant in the ancient context. That's still what it does. So I always kind of use this illustration. If there's a good restaurant, right, and you want to tell other people about how great that restaurant is, you're preaching about it. Whether you realize it or not, like you're preaching about it. When you announce the good news, when you announce good news, that is considered preaching. So these believers who are scattered because of the persecution of the church, they begin to announce the good news everywhere they go. But then in verse 5, in relation to Philip, it specifically said that Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them Christ. So obviously within English, those are two different words, and there are two different words in the original languages. And so when we look at the word proclaimed, what the word proclaimed means is to tell others about a person that they are to become acquainted with so that they can know what they need to know. It is to tell others of someone that they are to be acquainted with so they can know what they need to know. So in verse 4, we have this word preach. It's one Greek word, and then in verse 5, we have another Greek word that means proclaim. So why are these two words important? Why is Luke specific in using two different Greek words when technically they kind of describe the same thing? So why didn't he just use the same words twice? Well, the first one, preach, is what all Christ followers do when they are scattered. Everywhere they are going, throughout Judea, throughout Samaria, they are announcing the good news of Jesus. So they are walking into towns, they are making this proclamation of there is a way in which you can be in relationship with God both now and forever. And the way that takes place is through a guy named Jesus. And he came to this earth and he lived the life that you and I were supposed to live, but we couldn't because of our disobedience towards God. He lived that perfect life. But then because of our disobedience, he went to the cross and he paid the punishment. He was the sacrifice for us. He was the substitutionary atonement for us. But then he was buried in the grave, but because he himself did not sin, that he rises from the dead so that humanity can be as God intended us to be. If we trust in who Jesus was, then you can live the life he intends you to live and be in relationship with him both now and forever. This was the good news that that those who were scattered are preaching, and it is also the good news for us, for our world today. This is still good news for people, that there's a way in which they can be in relationship with God both now and forever. And so wherever they're going, what they're doing is they're preaching. They're announcing good news. So in some ways, when we come to church and we talk about the preacher, or like Nate is the preacher, or Kim, she is the preacher, like whatever titles we give to people, like that is what I'm doing now, but that is what you do every single time you proclaim the greatness of who Jesus is. You're preaching. You're a preacher out within the world. So we have this taking place within everybody that's going out, but then Philip is said not to only have preached, because he's included in that, but he proclaims. So he is telling people there's somebody that you need to be acquainted with so that you can know what you need to know. And so what's interesting with the reason Luke does this is because of who Peter is going to, or who Philip is going to spread the message of Jesus. He's going to a group known as the Samaritans. Now, the Samaritans in the New Testament time are such a fascinating and interesting group of people. There was very much a strong hostility between those who were Jewish and those who were Samaritans. So within this line of Jews and Samaritans, the Samaritans, they were a group of people and they claimed the same history as Israel, and they also claimed the same God as Israel, but because back when the Babylonians were going on in ancient Israel history, they decided to marry other people groups outside of Israel, the Canaanites specifically. So they began to marry these different people groups. So for those who were in the Jewish faith that only married within the Jewish ethnic group, they would look at Samaritans and they would literally, within the first century, call them half-breeds. They were like, you're not pure, you're not Jewish as we are Jewish. You are separate, like you are unclean because you defiled yourself by sleeping and marrying other cultures. So therefore, when it comes to worshiping God, you can't come to the temple in Jerusalem and worship God. And so there was this hostility within the first century world. We see this within Jesus encountering the woman at the well, Samaritan. Like there's this hostility between Jews and Samaritans. And so the Samaritans had this belief, along with the Jews, that they changed it a little bit, that there would be one who would come who was known as a tahib, or a restorer. And this restorer would come, and then he would allow them to worship God as they were supposed to. So you have the Jews proclaiming that there was this one called the Messiah that was going to come and do the same thing. For the Samaritans, he was known as the tahib, the restorer. And so they were waiting for that day to come. And so then you have a guy named Philip who goes and says, let me tell you about the one that you need to be acquainted with so that you can do what you need to do. So he is going to them with a specific message. He's taking this common knowledge they have of this tahib and says, I know that you're expecting this restorer to come, but let me tell you that the restorer has come. That he came for the Jews, and he also came for the Samaritans, and he came for those in Antioch, those in Rome, those in Africa. Let me tell you about the one named Jesus. So he is taking a common understanding of the people and says, let me tell you what you are actually looking for. And so for us today, for us to understand that the same method that Philip uses to tell others about Jesus is actually an effective method for us to tell others about Jesus. So within our culture, there are common things that people look forward to give them hope. So the ancient Samaritans, they're looking for this tahib to come. That is the hope of their people. Even today, there are things that people follow after that they look forward to give them hope within our culture. Right? Not necessarily a guy that's going to be a tahib or a restorer, but there are things that people look to give them hope. So a couple of examples that I think are very pointed within our culture is the first is money. Money is a great example of this, right? Like we grow up in a culture thinking like if I could just get enough money, then I'll have the security of not having to worry about that anymore. Like there's even that underlying belief when it comes to money. If I get to X amount of money, then I will be happy because I can buy the things that I want to buy. I can go the places I want to go. I can do the things that I want to do. Like we would never actually maybe admit that out loud, but we're like, if I could just get to this much money, then I would be happy. There's this hope that becomes tied in with money, right? That you don't have to look far into culture to see that. But then also another example of this is influence, especially within the younger generation. I also realized that when I was writing this, I'm now the old guy that says the younger generation because I'm not in the younger generation anymore. But within the younger generation, there's this strong pull of the hope of influence. Especially within the social media realm, that if they could just be followed by enough people, or if I could just get enough likes, then I will know that my life matters, that people are paying attention to me and what's going on in my world. So therefore, students within this generation that's coming up, they will do nearly anything possible to increase their notoriety online because the power, the hope of influence that brings. But what we can't do as adults is be like, yeah, see, that's the problem with Generation X that's coming up. They want all influence. We do the same thing as adults. We just call it politics. We put all of our hope, all of our future into the political realm. So we want political influence because we think that the way of the future is like, oh, we got to buy into this political ideology. Like this is the thing that gives us hope, or we're going to buy into this political leader. And so we want hope. And so so many adults are willing to sell out so many different things of their belief system in order to buy in to a political system because we believe that's going to be the hope of the world. But what we've got to realize, what Christ followers we have to be aware of and guard against, is we must understand that neither one of those things are going to bring about hope within the world. Money will not bring it. Political power and social media influence will not bring, those three things will not bring hope within the world. You will never get to the point where you have enough money to where you feel like you are comfortable. Ask to anybody that makes more money than you if they feel comfortable. They will say no. Because that is not the purpose of what money is designed to do, is bring us hope. There is not any amount of likes or follows that you could have on social media in which you would say, like, I'm now content with who I am. The comparison game will always be there. There is never a point in which there will be a political party arise that makes this world perfect. But the beauty of the gospel is when we try to look to those things, we as Christ followers say, I know what you're looking for, but let me tell you the one that can actually do those things. If you want security, then why don't you trust in Jesus that is going to guard you and protect you and watch over you as a father would a child? Why don't you trust in Jesus? I know you want to know that you have identity, and I know that you want to have hope and that you matter within this world, and you're looking in all the wrong places. Let me tell you about Jesus that calls you a son and daughter of the King. And no matter what takes place in your life, good or bad, that status will not change. You are a son and daughter of the King. Let me tell you about Jesus. Let me tell you about Jesus, who came and he instituted a kingdom within this world and said, this world is imperfect, but I'm going to establish a kingdom that is going to grow within this world so that people can see what a perfect world looks like. It's a foretaste of what is coming. See, what the world is looking for, we have the person who we can go to them and say, let me tell you how to get acquainted with this person that is going to give you everything that you so desire. Because see, things within humanity, while we are different, each one of us comes from different backgrounds, socioeconomic status, all of these differences within this room, there's things that hold us in common. Things of ancient world and things now. There are things that we look to tell us that we matter, that we have security, that we have hope within the world. Like every single human that's ever been created has this innate desire for those three things. And we can come alongside them and say, let me take that desire and point you to the one that can actually fulfill it. And so Philip takes this common language for them to understand. Let me tell you about the one that can actually do these things. A method that you and I can use to advance the gospel even in the current world in which we live. And we must not understand that our simple act of obedience goes further than what we could possibly imagine. Look in Acts chapter 8. This portion is a little lengthy. We're going to read in verse 26. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, rise and go towards the south, toward the road that goes down to Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert place. And he arose and he went out. And there was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all of her treasure. And he had come to Jerusalem to worship. And he was returning seated on his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, go over and join this chariot. So Philip ran to him, heard him reading Isaiah the prophet, and asked, do you understand what you were reading? And he said, how can I unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now, in the passage of scripture that he was reading was this: like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter. Like a lamb before his shearers, he was silent. So he opened not his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe this generation? For this life is taken away from the earth. And the eunuch said to Philip, about whom, I ask you, does this prophet say this? About himself or about someone else? And then Philip opened up his mouth, and beginning with scripture, he told them the good news about Jesus. And also they were going along the road that came to some water, and the eunuch said, see, here is water. What prevents me from being baptized? And he commanded the chariot to stop, and they both went out into the water, and Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. And they came up out of the water, and the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. But Philip found himself as Azotus, and as he passed through, he preached the gospel to the towns until he came to Caesarea. So you have a guy, again, kind of reiterating a thing we just talked about, who is the treasurer for the queen of the Ethiopians. Dude's got money. But yet he's reading because he understands that money's not going to provide everything that he has. But you have this guy named Philip who follows the obedience of the Lord. And he goes through and he begins to proclaim the gospel. And he goes from one area to the other. On the way, he runs into a guy from Ethiopia. So think back for a second. Acts chapter 1, Jesus says, you'll be the witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. At this point of the story of Acts, what we see, the gospel has gone to Jerusalem. The gospel has gone to Judea. The gospel is creeping into Samaria, has not gone into the utter parts of the earth yet. You have a simple guy whose name is Philip, who's not one of the original 12 with Jesus. He's one of the 7 that was just to make sure that the widows were taken care of. Now, he is the first one that proclaims the gospel outside of his ethnic group to another group of people, and this guy is known from Ethiopia. Now, when we think of Ethiopia, we think of a specific country in Africa. At this particular time in Roman history, Ethiopia was anything south of Egypt. It was a large swath of land. It was outside of the Roman Empire. And so, based on he's the treasurer for the Queen of Candace, this was a title for the Cushite kingdom. So today, that would be Sudan. So there's this ancient kingdom from the Cushites that you read about in the Old Testament. They would call their queen the Candace, and so they have this kingdom there that they have this treasurer who's interested in who God is because he's in Jerusalem. He's worshiping the one true God, and so he's reading this scroll that comes from Isaiah chapter 53, and so he's reading this on the way down, trying to figure out what it means. You have this simple guy named Philip who's being faithful in providing for the widows. He's going out and preaching the gospel only the way that he can, and so he's following Jesus' obedience, and then he crosses this path with this guy from Ethiopia. And he's reading this passage, and he goes, hey, can I tell you what that's about? Let me tell you about the one that he's talking about there. Because see, Isaiah 53, the passage that he is reading there, is a prophecy about Jesus. So in the previous example, he takes Samaria and he says, let me tell you about the one you need to be acquainted with. Tahib, he's actually already come. And then he goes and he explains through Scripture the greatness of who has come in Jesus. And so you have this guy who, again, not one of the original apostles, who's being faithful in what God has called him to do, and he is the guy that begins to take the gospel to the furthest reaches of the earth. Because you've got to remember at this particular time, when we look at that map, that's kind of the modern world as they saw it, or the ancient world as they saw it. So for this guy to be from Ethiopia, dude's from way far away. And so he shares the gospel with him. The gospel goes to the ends of the earth. So we talk about in the church all the time, we want you to go on this mission trip. We want you to go here. We want you to go there, which is fantastic. We want you to go on foreign mission trips. But we cannot overlook how your impact, your faithfulness in where you are right now can reach globally. That your simple act of obedience in telling people about Jesus here in Hernando, Mississippi can have global impact. So one of the best ways I can explain this is in my own personal life, there was a guy named Danny Hinton. Danny Hinton was a mentor for me that I worked with at Getwell when I was an intern in 2007. Danny taught me so much about who Jesus was and legitimately increased my love for who Christ is. I am not who I am today without Danny Hinton entering into my life. So Danny Hinton has never been to the country of Lesotho in Africa, ever. He's never been there, never has any upcoming trips or anything like that. But because Danny invested in me, and he's taught me Scripture, and he's taught me to deepen my love for the Lord, I had the chance in 2014 to go to Lesotho and preach the gospel in Lesotho. Danny was faithful where he was, and yet he had an impact in Lesotho, Africa. The same is true about you. Your faithfulness in what Christ has called you to do and sharing the gospel with other people and bringing them and say, let me tell you about the one you need to be acquainted with, has global impact, and you never even have to leave Hernando. Because this is the providence, the power of God within our world. I have a guy named Philip that I guarantee you 2 weeks before this situation, if you would have told him, Philip, you are going to spread the gospel in Ethiopia. He's thinking, no, I'm not. How am I going to do that? Lo and behold, he runs into one of the most powerful guys within the Cushite kingdom and says, let me tell you about Jesus. Because his simple act of obedience. And so we never know how our telling of others to get acquainted with Jesus will impact the world around us. So this morning as we end, we've got 2 questions that are before you. The one, is there anything within our lives, anything within your life that you are looking for hope in that is outside of Jesus? A hard examination within yourself, especially if you're a Christ follower, because what that is doing is exposing a spot in your life that in which you are saying, Jesus is not Lord of my life in this area. Is there something, money, influence, something else, that we are looking for hope in, that we think it's going to provide us security in, to provide us purpose in? Is there something that we're looking to outside of Jesus to provide what only Jesus can provide? Because I'll be the first one to tell you that's super easy and tempting to do. And so there may be some of us who are Christ followers who are going like, oh man, I'm giving that way too much power within my life. But there may be some of us in this room that have been looking to those things instead of Jesus. And today may be the morning in which you say, like, I'm leaving those things behind. They cannot provide what I desire, what I need in my life, but Jesus can. So I am turning and I'm following after Jesus. There's maybe some of you in here this morning that make that first time say, like, man, this is it. I'm following after you. Or for those who are Christ followers in here, who is the one person in your life that you know is looking for something else outside of Jesus for hope, where you can enter into a conversation and say, let me tell you about the one that is going to fulfill what you are looking for everywhere else? That we see a pattern, a method laid out in Philip's life that we can legitimately use to spread the gospel within our circles of influence within our world. And so I'm going to pray over us this morning, and I've done this before, but I'm going to give us a moment to just be silent, for you to spend time in prayer. And I'm going to pray that in that silence, the Lord is revealing to you that one person, or maybe you're that one person. That your eyes, your heart will be awakened to what it is, who it is that the Lord is trying to place on your heart this morning that needs to know, hey, here's the one that you need to be acquainted with. So let's pray together.